The Spell of the Sorcerer's Skull by John Bellairs, Chapter 1. Phooey! Phooey on winter and snowy white snow and jingle bells and walking in winter wonderlands. Bah! We should never have come up here in the first place. It was a cold February night in the year 1952, and snow swirled around the picturesque white houses and the sprawling old Fitzwilliam Inn in the beautiful little New Hampshire town of Fitzwilliam. Its whitened roofs and the grass of the town common, an oblong park that the town was built around, and fell on the heads and shoulders of two people who were trudging slowly around the common. One of these was a short, red-faced elderly man, Professor Roderick Childermass. He had a strawberry nose and wildly sprouting mutton-chop whiskers, and he was wearing a battered, shapeless fedora and a threadbare and dirty tweed overcoat. His hands were jammed into the pockets of the coat, and as he stomped along, he kept making bad-tempered comments. Walking next to him was a pale, bespectacled boy named Johnny Dixon in a red stocking cap and a blue parka and galoshes. Johnny was shy and nervous-looking. He kept looking anxiously at the professor, and every now and then he would open his mouth to say something. Suddenly he would change his mind and stay silent. "Winter paradise, indeed!" snorted the professor, glancing fiercely this way and that. "I'd like to give a piece of my mind to the boneheads who settled up in this godforsaken wilderness, and the cheapo types who run the state and don't provide enough money to clear the roads or sand them in the winter-time." "Please, Professor," Johnny said in a mild, placating voice, "don't be angry. Please don't. Everything will be all right. It really will, you'll see. We've got a room at the inn for tonight, and they're towing your car right now. It's not so bad, really it isn't, and I'm having a good time. The town is wonderful, and I like the inn a lot. And I like going places with you, so don't worry. It'll be all right." The professor stopped scowling. He turned and smiled kindly at Johnny, and then he reached out and patted him on the shoulder. "Well, as long as you're not too disappointed," he said. "I'm sorry I lost my temper, but I get wrathful every time I think of that slippery road and us skidding and sliding into that ditch. I wanted to show you New Hampshire in the wintertime. And it really is quite beautiful in the snow. We were having a good time, and then that dratted accident had to happen." The professor paused. He turned and looked across at the large, shadowy inn on the far side of the common. Its windows glowed yellow, and smoke curled from the tall chimney. All around the common, houses were filled with lamplight. Candles winked in the darkness here and there. Snow swirled everywhere and was piling up on gate-posts and ledges and roofs. It was a lovely, dreamy Christmas card scene. "Ah, well," said the professor, "I suppose things could be worse." A gust of wind hit him, and he shivered. "Brrr! But it is getting cold out here. How about it? Shall we head back to the inn and have a nice hot drink by the fire before we turn in? I think a hot toddy or a brandy or two would improve my disposition immensely." Johnny agreed, and they started back. As they drew near to the inn, they heard the grinding sound of an engine, and turning to their left, they saw a tow truck crawling up out of the dark hollow behind the inn. Hanging from the tow chain was the professor's maroon Pontiac. Its right headlight had been gouged out, and the right front fender was a shapeless mess of dented squash metal. The two travelers watched solemnly as the tow truck rolled past. Again, Johnny shot a glance at the professor, but he was relieved to see that the old man was taking things calmly. Johnny liked the professor a lot. He had met the professor a little over a year ago, right after he came to live with his grandparents in the city of Dunstan Heights, Massachusetts. At the time, he had been scared and lonely. His mother had died recently, and his dad had gone off to fly a jet in the Korean War. Later, his dad had been discharged from the Air Force, but he had enlisted because the Air Force had needed his special skill. But he had re-enlisted because the Air Force needed his special skills as a pilot. The professor had befriended Johnny, and his friendship had been like a wonderful gift. He played chess with Johnny, taught him how to bake cakes, and went places with him. He argued with him about war and politics, and really listened when Johnny tried to give his opinion about something. For a shy kid who was used to being ignored by grown-ups, this was really something incredible. Johnny was proud to be the professor's friend, and he was willing to forgive him when, every now and then, the professor lost his famous temper. A little later, the two of them were relaxing in one of the parlors on the first floor of the old inn. It was a cozy room with its cushiony armchairs and sofas, frilly-shaped floor lamps, and faded, tattered red oriental rug. A fire was roaring in the fireplace, and its light flickered over old dusty paintings and a gilded banjo clock with a brass eagle on top. The professor was sitting in a saggy armchair by the fire, with his shoes off and his feet propped up on a low footstool. In his hand was a glass of brandy, and he was smoking one of his black and gold Balkan Sobrane cigars. His eyes were half closed, and the look on his face said that he was at peace with the world. Johnny was standing over by a low bookcase in a corner, leafing through some of the books. He was trying to find one that would be fun to read in bed. The professor sipped his brandy and smiled blissfully. "Ah," he said, "sitting around and doing nothing is one of the great underrated pleasures of life. Tomorrow I know that I will have to do something about that wretched car, but right now I wouldn't move a muscle to save it if it were about to fall off a—" "Hi there," said a friendly, rumbly voice by the door. "Can I come in and join you guys?" The professor and Johnny turned and looked. It was the owner of the inn, a man about 60 years old with grizzled gray hair and a leathery, seamed face. He wore a plaid shirt and a saggy, unbuttoned woolen sweater, old stained work pants and battered hiking boots. He was smoking a pipe and leaning against the doorpost with his arms folded across his chest, looking very relaxed and at home. Of course. Please, come in," said the professor, motioning with his hand. "There's an extra chair here, right by the fire, and it is your inn, after all. Have you met my young friend John Dixon? He's my partner in this ill-fated northern expedition." Mr. Spofford walked across the room and shook Johnny's hand warmly. Then he went to the armchair that stood near the professor's and sank into it. He leaned back and stared at the fire, puffed his pipe for a minute or two. He looked tired and was obviously glad to have a chance to just sit and catch his breath for a bit. After a few more minutes of silent meditation, Mr. Spofford turned and smiled at the professor. "They get your car out of the ditch okay, did they?" The professor nodded glumly. "Yes, they did. I'm going over to Who's garage tomorrow morning to see if it will be possible to drive the filthy heap of rust back home. But for now, I'm just glad to be here, safe and sound." Glad to have you, said Mr. Spofford pleasantly. He leaned back and blew a stream of smoke at the mantelpiece. "I see, by the way you signed the guest book, that you're a professor. Mr. He paused and grinned apologetically at the professor. "I'm sorry, I hate to admit it, but I couldn't read your handwriting."